self-judgment. Risa?
In a world that is continually becoming more connected in the world, we think that communication has become intertwined with human rights, and we think in this particular scenario, oftentimes we think that we need to preserve this communication as a means to allow us to have those human rights in the first place. I think there needs to be some clarification as to what exactly this particular policy will look like. I think it's quite simple. There are a few prongs to this. Number one, we think that you should not be discriminated for your access to the internet. But number two, we think that people should not be charged differently for access. So for example, when it comes to net neutrality, different providers cannot charge you differently for different access to different amounts of things, for example. But lastly and more importantly, no one should be blocked entirely off internet access if they so seek to approach or to find internet access in the first place. What does this look like in general? We think that we would likely enshrine this in the law, and more importantly, we will also provide free access to the internet as and when we see public spaces like land shop but better for like not $2 per hour but free. But more importantly, we also see that this is already something that already exists in status quo, where we see things like internet being already subsidized when it comes to different telcos in all these places. So we think that governments do recognize that there is a fundamental right to internet access because it helps facilitate communication. Why then do we think that communication is so inherently important? But I want to just premise this argument on the idea that when it comes to your denial of any form of communication, when it comes to things like solitary confinement, we do note that your ability to not, your inability to seek any communication and any form of ability to communicate with another person means that you often this particular form of torture, this particular form of treatment is often considered torture in nature. We think the same is akin to when you are denied your ability to seek or to access the internet in the first place. So why then do we think that this particular thing is important? 4 reasons. I'm going to explain to you: 1 on geographical, 2nd on information, 3rd on access, and 4 on outcomes. So first and most importantly, we think that when it comes to geographical locations, often you are born into places where you have no control over. So for example, like based on the birth lottery, you're born into like Middle East or like Australia or all these places where you reasonably don't have access to your life choices in general. What this often means is that you're forced to communicate with often people that you don't actually like, or you don't actually know, or you don't actually understand in the first place. We think that what internet actually does is that it helps to bridge the connection across spaces, which means that it allows you not to be alone, and it allows you to escape from torture that exists otherwise if you are unable to communicate with other people that is akin to you, for example. So if you are trapped in this particular environment, we think that those things are bad. But secondly, and more importantly with regards to this argument, is this idea of freedom of association. We think that it is important for everyone to be able to freely associate with anyone they so wish to seek. So for example, I'll give you a very clear example. If I was still a poly kid and I now joined debating, and I didn't have internet access, I would never have seen Ashish or whoever debate in the first place. And that ability for me to find information in the free market or in the internet means that I cannot actually access intellectual discourse and ability for me to understand different things and learn new things in the first place. I'm uniquely trapped in my own circumstances, and that's particularly bad. Secondly, about information, and I think this is quite easy, right? I think when it comes to democracy, sit down, we think that there needs to be some ability and mechanism by which people check who they vote for. And the reason is very simple, because the rights of a country to control you is in excess, like yesterday's Ashish's argument. But in these particular areas, we do note that given your ability to be controlled by the state, we therefore need a certain mechanism for us to check and balance whether or not your government is doing the right thing for you. The problem here is that if you do not have access to the internet, you are not able to access free information than compared to the other spheres to be able to determine whether or not the government has done right by you. We think that the dissemination of information is especially dissemination of information is especially important, especially problematic if you are denied access to these particular things. We think that in order for us to truly be able to check what our government does to us and what our government doesn't do to us, we think that it allows us to therefore be able to participate freely in a civic society in the first place. We think that information is often more important than not. But secondly, let's talk about how it allows people to make choices. Given that there's information that exists on the internet, it allows us to make make decisions based on the information that's presented to us on the internet in the first place. We understand that when it comes to these kind of things, we do note that there are influx of information all around, but we think that the sole agent of the decision is you, and we think that internet access allows you to do that. But third, let's talk about access. We think that when it comes to technology, we think that technology has advanced to the point where we cannot escape it. In terms of your ability to seek human rights, we think that often it is tied to internet access. What do I mean by this? So if you are hurt or if you are harmed, we think that it is very likely that your ability to seek emergency services is often tied to whether or not you can find internet in those places in the first place. In many of these reasons, we think that the same thing applies to many other human rights, and we think that those things are important. But yes,
fundamental human rights are supposed to be of absolute and irreducible nature. Could you please explain how any of what you've just presented qualifies under those two particular criteria?
Yeah, we think it's irreducible in nature, and we think that those things are important. I don't really get the question, but never mind that. So the more we trend towards this particular world where technology is more and more dependent, there are a few things that you need to know. Number one, when you move towards technologically advanced places, it often tends to favor people who are technologically literate, which means that when government services start demanding that you use SingPass, people who do not use SingPass will end up like not being able to access government services, or at least be able to be will access these in you have to access more hoops in order to access these services in the first place. What often ends up happening is that you are locked out of governmental services and you aren't allowed to have those services at the convenience of your hands because you don't know how to use the internet. What are the outcomes of this? Number one, we think that it emancipates the poor, which means that it allows farmers, like for example, we think that the ability for you to access the internet is that you often allow farmers to collaborate with one another to make sure that there's optimal outcome amongst other things. We think that those things are inherent benefits that would otherwise be gone if you force them to just communicate amongst their own people and refuse to allow for optimal outcomes in the free market. But secondly, more importantly, I just want to point out that this debate is about comparatives. So obviously when it comes to governments, they still are able to censor different kind of information. But we think that at the very least, information is still better than none. And in a world where we think that internet access is so important, we are very proud to do
it. Thank the Speaker for that speech. To open the case to slide opposition, call on the yellow.
Opening opposition stance is pretty straightforward. We're not going to recognize internet access as a fundamental human right, but we're going to suggest as a case that it is a precursor, the precursor, to the greatest scale of unprecedented repression of all other classes and civil liberties. It is a fundamental human, and so be very clear, a fundamental human right is supposed to guarantee a specific inalienable area of freedom that is critical to the flourishing of human life. So yes, perhaps internet access is good in certain areas, in the way that they claim. But that is characterization that explains why internet access is a merit good, i.e. something that is desirable for the government to provide to people, but doesn't explain fulfill the burden of the motion, which is to explain to us why specifically this particular right is necessary to provide that particular flourishing of human life. I will also suggest to you that the reason why it is also just not true that internet access should be considered a human right is because it comes at trade-offs that don't recognize the absolute and irreducible nature of other fundamental rights, such as, for example, the right to information and the right to thought and privacy, which I'm going to talk about in my speech. So very quickly, thank you, I want to suggest that this whole access to digitized services and how being locked out of these services isn't actually a big problem. So a lot of the issues that come with this, the benefit that they have is a benefit of convenience that does not satisfy the actual, guys, is this recording?
Yes.
Okay. So I think that the point that I'm trying to make here is that the convenience or the benefit of convenience does not satisfy for what we deem to be necessary to a human flourishing. It just doesn't make any sense for them to suggest that that is the benchmark by which we should decide that this is going to be a human right for people. I'm going to then integrate all my responses into this argument that I have about the right to thought and privacy and how it's being eroded by internet access and why that fundamentally is the worst possible thing for humanity. So the first thing I would like to challenge is this whole OOG's arguments about how dissemination of information is very important. Because let's be very clear, I think that in the current climate of information and the whole like InfoWars thing is that it's probably better for those who are vulnerable, the less educated, for example, to probably refer to mainstream media outlets that are structurally able to be held more accountable, as opposed to, for example, like social media random outlets, like for example, literally like Alex Jones, like literally no plausible way for you to like hold these structures accountable. But also I would suggest to you that a lot of the times the way information is currently disseminated on the internet is not as streamlined or monolithic to produce the outcome that Yao Kun talks about. In order for those things to occur or those benefits to accrue, they have to show a clear and not fragmented way in which information is disseminated by various rose-tinted lenses. And these rose-tinted lenses come in the form of things like alternative facts and all those things like that. We would suggest to you that the way information is constructed right now on the internet, and internet access, what it does is gives a whole bunch of access for content contributors in so many different ways that is in an unregulated fashion. What impacts does this do these things have? On the first level, on a very primitive level, primal level, right, it affects the way you construct your political thoughts and subsequently a lot of aspects of your identity. We would suggest to you that the whole reason why there's a shift in political climate to become more polarized to begin with is because internet access has democratized a lot of information and content contributors, no thank you, that are otherwise have just festered and kept their mouths shut in whatever like random pockets of communities that they are in. We would suggest to you that the weakness in democracy currently is being exploited. The way in which minorities are currently harmed are largely due to the fact that internet access has largely shaped the way people think about minorities, and those echo chambers of information that are formed because of internet access are part of the reason by which like people can't like feel more comfortable staying within those echo chambers, because the internet access gives you access to places and on virtual spaces that are designed by algorithm to make you want to stay within those echo chambers. We would suggest to you that therefore it's fundamentally crucial for you. It's fundamentally critical in how it shapes your identity. Why is this bad though? The reason why it's bad is because I think everyone here can basically agree that thoughts are constructive of who you are, and the reason why internet access cannot be qualified as a human right is because there's a high propensity for it to actually be used to manipulate you, and it currently is, unfortunately. And that's a form of slavery. No, thank you. It's a form of slavery to which you are unable to defend yourself against, especially if you do not have very good and clear structural access to your education. This is why the right to education therefore matters in this debate, for example, because it is a form of self-defense against this sort of information, and that's something that's important. We would suggest to you that sort of the uniform ability for people to get a very clear structural access to education is far better that we live in a world that internet access is not considered a form of human right. Therefore, what is the whole point about privacy then about? We would suggest to you that given the way internet access opens a whole realm of abuse for things like surveillance, we would suggest to you that there's a loss of control over information about who you are. The personal particulars and preferences that make the person that you are currently is being monetized and sold by big data companies. So like, for example, the Cambridge Analytica scandal was the best example of how Facebook, for example, took your information and decided to give it to political advertisers that basically took advantage of all the information to send you fake political ads. We would suggest to you that that's the world in which they crazily change the way you view yourself, and also to interact with the way people interact with people around you, and how that oppresses a whole minority. But from on to conclude this point, yes. Closing.
So the right to education can also be manipulated by governments to mislead people. But yet we still recognize that is something we should aspire towards and provide people because people need it.
In the context that you describe, where the government tries to use it to manipulate people, is a world in which clearly it's just a non-liberal context that cannot function in this debate. It's a weird context to use to make a point, especially because it's just uncomparative to the context that is being used in the opening of. Clearly, we would suggest to you that the whole privacy point is important because it creates a culture of insecurity-based demand. What does this look like? It means that the way what you are and the person that you are and whatever insecurities that can be extrapolated from the big data that's taken from you is used against you to benefit people that clearly don't give a shit about you. But more importantly, the whole reason why it is bad is because you create the inability for you to ever be satisfied with yourself, which is arguably the most pernicious form of oppression. This is why we argue that crucially it's the precursor to the most dangerous and pernicious kind of oppression that therefore does not qualify as a human right. We would suggest to you that things like, for example, fear of missing out on social media, FOMO, is a result of, for example, the personal life boundaries being diminished in a world in which you are encouraged to share a lot of things online through internet access. we would suggest to you that if this is the world that you live in, you are more likely as an individual to feel pressured to revealing more and more about yourself, but also contribute to the insecurities of other people. Meaning to say that when you trigger this human right, you are actively harming someone else's ability to feel happy about themselves. This is incredibly pernicious, and for these reasons, because it violates the right of thought and right of privacy, which are incredibly fundamental. For these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Do you want your speech deleted?
Whatever lah. I just didn't know. I was like, wait, what?
Okay.
Oh, you go find this off guard.
Yeah, I mean, telling about Cambridge on Facebook, on fucking YouTube.
Okay, thank you for that speech, DPM. Yeah.
What's the location?
There are kind of two complementary ways in which you can read this motion. The first question of the motion is internet access a human right by the normal ways we think of human rights? The second is, should we consider it a human right and what happens after that? It's very interesting that the main response to all of Yao Kun's material about why it is a human right, answering the first question, is a rehash of bits of Ashish's lecture taken out of context to say, but it doesn't meet the standards of absolute human rights. But then the rest of the opening opposition's case doesn't actually answer that question either. It just is some benefits of not having this as a thing that people want to access. So that's strange. But first thing I want to do in my speech is re-establish why we do in fact meet the threshold for this being a human right. And the next is I want to deal with the outcomes that then flow if we establish it as a human right, regardless of whether you think it meets your threshold or not. So first thing, why doesn't Ashish's lecture rebuttal respond to Yao Kun's material? The reason is the word fundamental is not actually in the motion, which is to say, we don't have to defend internet access as the same level as the right to torture, but we can say that it allows you to access things like protect yourself from the right to torture. Note that when they talk about a right to education, it is not clear that the right to education exists on the same level as the right not to be tortured. It doesn't. It's not absolute. It's the same sort of right that you can't trade off against other rights. And we think the right to internet access exists on the same level. These guys have clearly talked up the right to education. So as long as we can prove that the right to internet access is on the same level as the right to education, we shouldn't use this rebuttal anymore. Why do we think it actually does so? Well, the first thing Yao Kun tells you is about internet access allowing you to access connections and prevent yourself from being alone. An important thing to note here is that being alone is something which we think is absolutely awful in a human condition. We consider solitary confinement, that is to say, taking a person and leaving them away from any sort of human contact to be a form of torture, which actually breaches the absolute right not to be tortured. I would say to you that for people who are born out of circumstance into families who absolutely despise them because of who they grew up to be or who they are, these people have not chosen the people around them, and in many instances feel just as alone as the person in solitary confinement. The internet allows people to break these boundaries. It allows people to connect people they would choose to connect to, and therefore we think it's an important way in which you access the right not to be tortured, even in the weak sense. So it's the first reason why it is a human right. The second thing is the right to information, and again, there's very little response to this, because what Yao Kun tells you is that for political and civic participation to occur, and opening opposition seems to agree that we debate this in a liberal-ish democracy, but know that this is true even if you don't think that democracy is the best mode of government, because presumably you also believe that any mode of government should have its citizens be able to feed back to its leaders or its rulers what ought to be done. In order to do that, you need to access information. The one question about all of opening government is, do they think that the media outlets they like the press, are a human right? Because if they are, then an internet allows you to access these media outlets more readily than they already do, then internet access is a human right. It's an alternative way in which you can access the media outlets that opening opposition stands for, that they themselves would probably agree is required for information, for you to make even basic choices and decisions in every part of your life, let alone the sorts of choices that determine the way your life works in a society and the way your government makes decisions over every aspect of your life. That's why it's a human right. But thirdly, Yao Kun points out that in societies, the reality of the way things work is that we trend towards the level of technology that's widely and freely available to most people, even if some people don't have that access because it's not granted to them as a human right. Which means when governments and companies alike operate on the common assumption that serves their profit motive or serves efficiency, that everyone has internet access, people who don't have internet access, when you don't guarantee them as human right, are carved out of these services. And that is likely to happen because no one actually focuses on emancipating everyone, and like these emergency services like being able to call an ambulance or being able to like renew your citizenship status are on the internet. Even if there are like ways to get around the fact you're not on the internet, people shouldn't have to jump through these hoops because it makes our life so much more difficult. That's why internet access allows you to access other rights, and it's a right we should respect. On outcomes, and here I will engage with opening opposition's material on how internet is a pernicious and like not great media space. So the claims that opening opposition says are like, well, it allows bad actors. It's often structured in a way to like hook your attention and so on and so forth. Like social media is bad and causes fear of missing out and so on and so forth. The thing here is, there is no means in which you can regulate these things or hold these things to a high standard if you aren't saying internet access is a thing that everyone is going to access and is a right that everyone will access. It's much easier to say, well, internet access is a human right, so we as the government now have the duty to make sure that right is something that's meaningfully accessible and not fucked up for everyone. When you don't have that codification of internet access as a human right, you're less able to go to Facebook and say, you are making human lives shit, so we're going to break you up. You have to use other justifications like antitrust and random economic stuff, rather than just saying, you are not providing the sort of rights-based access that we think is good. So we agree that these things are like not ideal, but if you want to solve them, then you ought to make internet access a human right. But also I think they're just irrelevant because to the actual motion, because the fact that something like can be imperfectly accessed, the fact that like some news media outlets lie or make mistakes or support the government when the government is oppressive, don't make access to information or free press any less of a right. The fact that your freedom of speech can sometimes harm others doesn't make that less of a right. It just means that it's a right that ought to be regulated and balanced off against other rights. So all this argumentation is actually not irrelevant to the motion. But we think the outcomes are actually just kind of net good. The first thing we point out to you, and this extends on what Yao Kun says, is it gives people economic emancipation. Building on what I said earlier about the trend in which governments and companies alike operate on the lowest possible technological denominator, it then stands to reason that if you have access to the internet, you instrumentally benefit in terms of being able to access things like market information and so on and so forth that connect you to like suppliers and connect you to buyers in a way that has lifted lots and lots of people out of poverty. Because in the past, where they were unaware of these market information, they would be charging lower prices or prices below where the market would bear. These people either just worse off, or they wouldn't have someone to buy their crops and so on and so forth. So that's the first benefit. The second benefit is you hold governments to account. And these guys say, well, governments often use the internet to oppress you. That's true, but these people will be worse off in a world where the government could use the internet to oppress you, but they didn't have the free access to the internet to fight back against that government oppression. Technological methods of oppression like surveillance exist in this debate regardless of whether internet access is a human right. The question in this debate, on the instrumental side, is whether people have the information to fight back.
Thank the speaker for that speech. DLO.
Before I move on to talk about substantive material, allow me to make one main clarification. So in the DPM, we heard that it is not their burden to defend the internet access as being a fundamental human right. But the next question that I have to ask is, what do you consider a non-fundamental human right? We think it's not very fair to characterize this debate such that you are only willing to defend the internet access as a civil right, because in the event the internet access is deemed as a civil right, how exactly are lawsuits going to look like? You cannot possibly sue a private institution or entity for not giving you your access to the internet. This debate has to be about fundamental human rights, and the government being accountable for it, and the government recognizing that it is a fundamental human right. Otherwise, all kinds of benefits are extremely marginal. Otherwise, there's no proper mechanism to ensure how private companies have a fundamental duty and obligation to protect individuals and care about their choices. We think that the only way in which this debate can play out is if we adopt Joel's frame of the debate. That is to say that human rights, that it is OG's burden to firstly prove to you what exactly the threshold of a fundamental human right is and why exactly it meets it, rather than just dismissing it carelessly in DPM, telling you that no, this is not what this debate is about. I think that Joel was extremely clear when he told you in his framing, right? That when you're talking about fundamental human rights, you're talking about goods that are not just deemed to be merit because it protects not just because it gives some kind of a social benefit to society, but also because it is extremely essential in allowing for all other kinds of human rights to flourish. At the point, Joel came up with extensive analysis to tell you how you undermine people's freedom of thought via policing, via manipulation of information on the internet. Clearly, the responses coming up from the Deputy Prime Minister were insufficient. So, this is where I want to talk about a couple of things, right? Let's deal with OG's case first. They said that the internet is a platform for communication, which would therefore allow people to access some kind of human rights via, I don't know, intellectual discourse or whatsoever. Okay, several responses to this, right? Number one, recognize that this is an extremely narrow view of the internet that which they purposely omitted facts on, right? Recognize that intellectual discourse that they speak of can only be accessed by people who have the education level to access it, to participate in those discussions and see value in those kinds of discussions. We think that the more realistic characterization of the world is that most users of the internet simply see the internet as a means for self-validation or as a means to manipulate other users of the internet to endorse their own personal ideologies, or perhaps to give themselves some kind of benefit from the use of the internet. But secondly, and more importantly, right, we think the vast part of the internet also contains vast swaths of information that are conveyed with inherent political motivations or other kinds of personal incentives that may very well be very perverse. We think that the people who seek information from the internet, which by the way has no checks and balances, are the very same individuals that they want to protect. What happens to those individuals on their side of the house is that these individuals become slaves to the ones who knew how to manipulate the internet content. These are the individuals who are slaves to the ones who are their oppressors, the ones who know what kind of rhetoric those underprivileged people are likely to buy into. How exactly is this going to look like? Because this is something that OG also didn't really want to talk about, right? We're talking about ways in which companies fervently pay for advertisements. We talk about how governments censor content on the internet and survey the kinds of activities that you have online. They also track the kinds of online activities, the things that you purchase, and therefore use it to perhaps gauge what kind of a person you are, what kind of inclinations you have, and therefore set certain kinds of prices for the products that you buy. We also talk about things of the rise of fake news, where individuals on the ground themselves manipulate the internet to forward their own kinds of political ideology. What kind of choice exists on their side? We are quite unsure as to how they managed to mechanize this point. We argue that on the comparative, people on their side have no choice. So this is where Jan came out and told you, but it's horrible when you have echo chambers, right? Okay, so let's just admit, maybe in our worst case scenario, there will be people who live in echo chambers. But why exactly is that necessarily a bad thing? They didn't really tell you either. We think that the internet is not a universal good, and for that reason, it should not be a fundamental human right. We think that more than anything else, in order to allow humans to access other kinds of fundamental human rights, such as the freedom of thought, and by extension, the freedom of speech, people have the most principled right to deserve, to choose when they want to opt out of a situation. What happens on their side when you make the internet a fundamental human right is that the people who choose to opt out are the ones that are being stigmatized. These are the individuals that people call country bumpkins, and they discriminate against these kinds of individuals. What happens on their side of the house essentially is that people are now being coerced into buying into the system of the internet, thinking that it is a good thing. These are the individuals who are ultimately slaves because they are coerced into believing into a system that finally oppresses them. What happens in this case is that people live their entire lives believing that this is the best way that they live because that is the ideology that they forwarded, and that's what they believe, that the internet is a right that they are entitled to. So at the point people endorse the internet callously to be a fundamental human right, that is when these are the very same individuals who become perpetrators of false information. These are the individuals who continue to use the internet as a means to continue coaxing other individuals who have yet to fully develop their own train of thought. That is where the internet becomes furthermore exploitative, and that's when individuals themselves see this form of coercion as a natural right. We think that's inherently problematic because you legitimize the kinds of ideologies that lead to oppression over the internet. But before I move on, yes.
Do you think a rights framework might be useful for us to be able to call out companies who use the internet in bad ways?
No, we don't think that that's the most relevant part of this debate. We think that ultimately your side still has the burden of proving why it should be a fundamental human right over like a civil liberty. So I don't think that private companies are the most important thing. But anyway, right, this is where Yard also comes up and he tells you something that, well, people are going to end up living in solitary confinement on our side of the house, which is a bad thing for a series of like value neutral reasons that he has given you, right? But I think the comparative here is that if you have people who are literally slaves to the rest of society, to your government, as well as to strangers on the internet who give you false information with every incentive to do so, we think that it's comparatively better on our side of the house if you liberate individuals by allowing them to have their own freedom of thought. It is only when individuals who have the ability to think about what kinds of values matter to them compared to being influenced by the kinds of political parties or ideologies that exist on the internet to legitimize their own ideologies. That's when individuals will not have their creativity stifled. That's when individuals have a better ability to self-actualize and develop themselves as individuals. We think if anything, it is a good thing as long as people make that informed choice. That is not to say the internet is going to be banned on our side of the house. The difference here is we don't think the internet should be recognized should be put on a pedestal and deemed as a human right. For all those reasons, I think our side is the one that liberates individuals.
Thank the speaker for that speech. Member of Council. Sorry, what?
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
Is this anyone's pen or is it just you?
It's a good
That's blasting.
That's the only important question. You got uncle already, bro. I'm so fucking uncle, bro. You haven't seen the way I take photos of my kids in the This on record, by the way.
Okay,
You and the
okay.
narration.
Still a bit holding for me. So just more stuff.
Yeah.
More.
Guys.
So I think the debate isn't whether or not access to internet is a freedom or is a fundamental human right, but it's about whether or not we believe that it should be, because the should implies that like when we do something, it's a good idea, right? So I think Opening House wanted to have this debate about what constitutes a fundamental freedom of right or whatever this fucking bullshit is, But the debate starts in closing because we're going to view comparatives and practical outcomes. So, before I integrate my rebuttals to OO's case, what's the one thing that stands out that doesn't really fit in? Which is that state-owned mainstream media is equally as good or is probably better than the internet. Fuck off! We think that oftentimes states control media to create ascriptive racist narratives to turn people against each other so that they vote for the incumbent party. We think that these things are just as likely to possibly be bought over by these governments and actually spread this rhetoric to make people do dumb decisions. I think that that's what actually happens. So, firstly, on what we think the policy is going to look like in our world and what are the practical outcomes of that. What are we going to do? We're going to immediately declare this to be a human right. We're going to get the UN on this. We're going to get a state of crisis or emergency. We're going to make it a metric as to how many individuals actually have access instead of things like, how many children are starving or whether or not these individuals have water, because we're going to show you why it's better. But here's the thing, right? We want this classification to trigger concern and feelings from individuals in similar ways that other rights currently do. We want things like, UN people going down there to create internet infrastructure, missionary jobs from schools who are going there for charity work. And here's the reason why we need it to be such an extreme measure, which is precisely what OO tried to talk about, which is when you make something a civil right, it's particularly difficult to enforce. What's an example of this? An example of this is democracy. It's a civil right. Why don't we have democracy around the world? Because the UN recognizes that democracy is something that's highly social and based upon the society that it needs to exist in. What's the difference between that and a human right? A human right needs to be awarded irrespective of the society and culture that exists because we are all humans irrespective of what kind of society we get to. So why then do we think that it's important to do these things? Because we need to recognize that this debate isn't necessarily about the developed world, because human rights in the developed world oftentimes is marginal difference whether or not it's considered that. It's about a developing country through which, for example, the access to internet isn't as opening houses have tried to establish, completely desolate that no one has fucking access to internet. It's that the rich and powerful living in your mega cities do, and your poor rural individuals don't. We think that at the point in which you have access to internet, where some individuals have access to internet where others don't, is the point at which we accentuate inequality. Before I move on into the practical impacts, why is this necessarily bad? We think that often, why is this a priori bad?
Clarification.
Or what does making it a human right do? Because when you establish it as a human right, you establish the fact that all individuals deserve it, which means that people are going to make efforts to spread this out. What's the problem with inequality, right? It entrenches poverty and status quo systems. Because at the point in which your rich individuals have access to internet opportunities to be able to, for example, market themselves, participate in e-commerce, educate and enrich themselves, is the point in which you keep these poor individuals forever entrenched until they get access to internet. And that's problematic, right? Because if we go through organic routes and methods, that's the point at which rich individuals would have already entrenched their benefits and have a head start, forever making this thing bad. Why is inequality a priori bad, or why is it that we need to give these people some degree of internet access? Because firstly, we think the internet constitutes a freedom of expression and the ability to put yourself out there. We think it's unfair and probably immoral and undignified to deny individuals access to a platform through which they can access opportunities to actually fight their inequality. We think that inequality exists because we exist in a society of haves and have-nots. The ability to look at another individual and feel as if you're less than them makes you feel undignified. We think we respect that dignity. Secondly, we think it gives individuals more opportunities to overcome that inequality insofar as they can access things like e-commerce, education, so for example YouTube tutorial videos, or things like political knowledge so that they can actually vote out these incumbents. We think that when you allow individuals to try and surmount this wall of inequality is the point in which they feel as if their lives have more meaning, is the point in which they feel more human relative to other individuals around them, right? Before I move on.
Yeah.
Opening.
So, can you explain to us how the inability for you to ever be satisfied with yourself as a form of oppression is
I'm gonna talk about that later. I'm gonna talk about why small things are good, aka porn. So, next. Why is it then better than comparative aid? Because I think OO pushed out a challenge which is just we could be doing other things. First level, we think that economic empowerment is something that is uniquely accessed through the ability to provide people through internet. Because at the point in which you open up opportunities for these individuals is the point in which they can enrich themselves. What's the comparative kind of aid we give? Which is oftentimes perishable and consumable, things like food, water, or in the worst cases, things like clothes that oftentimes destroy local economies at the point in which your rich people send all the clothes, meaning that your local textile industries can't sell it to anyone. We think that comparative versions of aid oftentimes are counterproductive and in fact cripple your local economies, preventing them from actually attaining any wealth. Secondly, we think it creates better and more effective aid in the long run at the point in which you inform individuals about things like your corrupt government benefiting off of the aid that should have gone to the people, but instead is going to like your government officials and civil servants. We think that that's the point in which you create more accountable aid, and that's the point in which people benefit more in the long run. Lastly, on like free pornography, aka why the internet is good. I think that everybody has a right to access aspects which pleasure you and are relatively harmless in the long run. I think that this is just merely an example to tell you about the benefits that the internet gives you that OO fails to recognize in their speech, because they wanted to harp on about the insecurities and problems that social media gives to you without recognizing the fact that if you pointed these things out to any logical individual, they wouldn't give it up for the world. Because to us, the fact that you have access to the internet increases your quality of life. Even the ability to know whether or not I should bring an umbrella out there is extremely important to me being able to live a comfortable, or at least a relatively more comfortable life. We think that their version of a world in which like people get manipulated is also not relative, is also poor or comparative, right? Because the comparative on their side is, because what they're saying is that we'll end up in echo chambers. But the problem is that echo chambers already exist in your world in the form of birth locking and an inability to escape your village. Your literal best case of staying within your village with all your people is our worst case, in which people like actually manage to be put into echo chambers online. You do it in the physical world. Secondly, and furthermore, like obviously, regulations exist. We think that just because you have a free internet doesn't mean that anyone can do whatever the fuck they want. We think that regulations, security, guidelines of these companies exist anyway. So, I think the most important part about this debate is when we award people this right, when we constitute it as a right and we enshrine it in like humanitarian laws and humanitarian aid, what are the outcomes that can actually be achieved? And the fact that these outcomes outweigh the marginal FOMO or like social harms that O creates. For those reasons, go with closing up.
The next speaker for that speech, a member of
In this fuckshit Frankenstein replication of Ashisha's lecture yesterday, I want to ask one simple question in closing opposition. What is the internet? Because internet access is a word that's been bandied about in the government bench, but they've never actually concretized the extent to which they want to enshrine this specific right of access. And I think on that count alone, that entire bench should just take the bottom half. So what exactly do we think is a meaningful right to access this? We would suggest that if you argue that it is synonymous to the right to education, which we don't necessarily think that it is, even if that was the case, the idea that you have a right to education cannot be meaningfully achieved at the point at which the only school that you have is perhaps a half-illiterate, retarded teacher in a school that has a class that doesn't teach you anything meaningful except perhaps how to recite the Quran day by day. You wouldn't consider that an access to the right of education, and similarly, we think that just access to the infrastructure of the internet is not a sufficient defense on their side of the house. Two, OG cops out, right? They're like, this is a partial right, it's not really like a fundamental right, blah blah. Okay, but by taking on their standard, they are literally saying anything that brings good to this world, we consider it a right. Fuck off, right? Clearly, if you compare it to other things that exist in the world today, which is what we are going to do now. The thing is, we want to engage with this just marginally, because we think that to the extent to which things are fundamental and should be absolute and enshrined as rights, we need to mean two things, right? One, there is something to do with the fundamental dignity of being human being. Like clearly, right, given that we survived thousands of years without internet, we can be human, we can still have like literature and poetry and Lord Byron around fuck shit without internet. I think that doesn't deal with that. The second thing then would be that it is overwhelmingly good if everybody had access to this particular right. And to that end, here's where the partial thing doesn't make sense. Because to that extent, if it is true that individuals, or that it's only a right to the extent to which it creates overwhelming good, we're going to prove to you why making it into enshrined as a right is a bad outcome directly dealing with the closing government. Why exactly is this a bad thing? We suggest that when you enshrine things to the human right, what happens is that you increase the coerciveness of individuals opting into a particular mechanism, and also at the expense of other individuals. The problem is that, we're Asian, right? So I'm not gonna talk about principle crap. But when you say something, say right, and you want to enshrine it, you want to like fucking make the UN like sanction people who don't provide access to rights. This inherently suggests that that access must come at the expense of something else, because you need to institute a certain burden to ensure that things like infrastructure is built. Things like, for example, other things are put at the expense of it. Why exactly do we think that this is bad? Firstly, I think it all gives us some reason to believe why exactly the internet is not necessarily good for everyone. And I think that the CG's analysis is lazy, because they suggest that people wouldn't give up the internet for certain harms that exist on the internet. But that's not true. The reason why people wouldn't give up the internet is because they are not able to live without it. And the reason why we are not able to live without it is because increasingly, if you say that it is a right, you allow for governments to no longer have to invest in opt-out mechanisms for individuals who choose not to want to participate in the internet, for instance. So individuals now have no recourse. They are not able to have things like, for example, be able to go down to like the ICA in order to renew their passport, because they're just going to tell them to do these things online instead. We increasingly see these things as being true even in countries like Singapore, for example, and we suggest that we want to have a counteracting effect to this particular phenomenon, because we think there are strong reasons why individuals either one cannot properly access the full benefits of this and should be allowed opt-out mechanisms, or two, individuals should be able to opt out entirely from it by choice as well. But secondly, what exactly are the trade-offs that are inherent in this particular debate? Like literally, if you are saying that this is a right, we suggest that this exists in a world in which there is a trade-off in the amount of political capital that we have on the part of things like NGOs, international bodies, or any sort of independent actor that is able to ensure that these rights are given out to its fruition. Why then is that a problem? We think that firstly, like the internet access is actually just less important than many other things that we need to care about in this world, like access to water, like access to food, like access to not being discriminated against. The closest that they come to expressing why this is in any way equally important is the idea that it entrenches inequality. But the thing is, they give no mechanism as to how exactly the internet access is going to deal with those problems of inequality. I would suggest to you, the rural Bangladeshi that they wanted to talk about doesn't need the internet. They need clean sanitation as opposed to an infrastructure building that gives them something they don't know how to use anyway. So in those scenarios, if you make it into a human right, you recalibrate the priorities of individuals such that they end up investing resources and time into areas that are not even as rural as the ones we're going to talk about, but areas that are still visible to the common individual, but just don't have the same access to like the internet as other places like the urban areas, and you make the most vulnerable communities lose out as a result. Whatever, anyone.
Do you think it's useful to have an education as a right, even if countries are insufficiently able to provide it?
I had a response to this somewhere. We suggest that it's not actually, like, I don't think that it's necessarily like a very important right. The reason for that is because, and this fits back into analysis, the right to education has forced individuals into very problematic structures that we don't necessarily think actually created any sort of good for these people. So the idea that, for example, if you wanted like your child to work in your like hawker center or whatever, but you are forced to put that child into school instead, because the right to education means that you create things like credential society that don't allow individuals to opt out meaningfully from a structure that forces them to those forms of education, for example, is not a good thing that we think individuals should have. So that's why we don't think that is necessarily a good thing. Also, we think it exists on a trade-off scale, right? Internet, less important than education as well. On top of that, we suggest that there are specific mechanisms in which this trade-off happens. So firstly, we think that at the point at which you introduce a new right, you make it into a compelling priority, which therefore means that the limited amount of political capital that is in the world becomes moved over to this particular idea, which then moves it away from other pressing issues. This creates certain outcomes. Firstly, we suggest that things like NGOs, for instance, work with regards to pathways, right? So for instance, like if you wanted to help the most rural community, it takes the cooperation of various NGOs to enter into those communities to be able to provide things like sanitation and a long-run, long-term project to create those outcomes in those areas. The problem with the introduction of something that is less important into these places is that you reduce the political capital in order for those things to happen in favor of something that we think is significantly less important. The idea that this allows for economic access is just not true, because the idea of economic opportunity being able to be flourished on the internet is something that's only like available to individuals who are not as bad off. People who know how to use the internet, that's one. Two, are able to market themselves effectively on the internet, somehow being able to cut through the noise and the like big institutions that are able to control the internet right now to somehow be able to make more like changes. We don't think it's necessarily true. But then that goes to like this weird idea, right? If it's a right people are more likely to regulate it and make it better. Like, what the fuck, right? You had the right to life for the longest time. Life is pretty fucking shit right now. People don't give a shit. Because the idea is when you say something is right, you just force it to create things like the infrastructure of that tower, for example. You don't actually create incentives, do anything to make the access to those things better. For those reasons, we're very happy to oppose.
Yeah.
Just one moment.
Yes, right.
Okay. Thanks, Speaker, for that speech. Government, yes.
In the developed world, access to internet is ubiquitous. Internet censorship is marginal and you can always get around it. Competition between companies and widespread infrastructure means that free Wi-Fi can be found at every Starbucks and McDonald's regardless of the law. So the most important stakeholders in the debate are actually people in developing countries. Specifically, the divide we address, which is the rural-urban divide, because it explains that uneven access to the internet accentuates the harms of capitalism. Because urban elites own capital in the form of internet access and are then able to monopolize through the use of internet both the means of production, which are things like services that can be provided, job opportunities on Fiverr as well e-commerce, versus the rural have-nots, who are then shut out from both access to goods and services, but also the means of production and opportunities which exist on the internet. That's why we want to give you a mechanism to ensure these rights to internet access in the UNDHR as a universal norm, so it's recognized as inalienable, just like food and education. So in the short run, obviously, we won't guarantee universal access, just as we didn't solve world hunger overnight. But what we want to do is to redirect UN food funds and programs, and I agree to Sherman to some extent, there needs to be some redistribution. But we're going to take it away from provision of goods and services, which very often crowds out local industry. We're going to take it away from things like financial aid and infrastructure, which are very often squandered by corrupt, self-serving, elite governments who have no care for the rural poor anyway. And we're going to take it away from things like conditional aid, which very often interferes with government's ability to set sound economic policy, which for example, exacerbated economic crisis in Latin America and Africa. So we're going to redirect all these funds away from these things into providing infrastructure for internet access. And we think there's huge political will for this because as everyone has agreed, within the developed world, everyone already has internet access. It is seen as a good thing to have internet access. And you also have like corporations like Facebook and Google who will be more than happy to pump money into this. This money wouldn't have gone to starving African children because Google doesn't care about whether or not you have a toilet bowl. Sit down. So what are these infrastructure we're going to provide? Things like satellites, telecommunications technologies, access to things like cheap cell phones, 5G technology, right? Which have helped countries like Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia experience exponential growth by allowing them to leapfrog the stages of Rostow's economic model of development because they're able to move into tertiary services such as e-commerce and services without first building a manufacturing base within industries where they have no competitive edge anyway. So to the extent that we can bring growth, I think growth brings food. Growth brings water. Growth brings education. That's the wonderful thing about growth. So I don't necessarily see the trade-off coming from CEO. The problem within the status quo is that to build this infrastructure is a massive project which requires massive capital, that requires concerted effort from international agencies like the UN, like the Melinda Gates Foundation, like the largest tech companies in the world, right? And we think that the same way when UN actually recognize rights like food and poverty line work to eliminate 80% of world hunger and bring people above the poverty line, we think that enshrinement of this right is the same mechanism that needs to trigger the international awareness and effort into pumping our resources into these endeavors. Secondly, I think it is disgusting that debaters in first world countries are so horribly desensitized to the livelihoods of people in the developing world. Because to be honest, if you listen to everything Opening House said, right, it's so fucking trivial and so like first world problems. When you complain about like, what if you FOMO? What if you get cyberbullied? What if the government don't let you watch porn? Like, all all these things are not concerns of the developing world, right? Like to them, they will be happy to see porn. They will be happy to see advertisements because it's better than the alternative sources of information they have in the first place. So the trade-offs and impacts of CG far outweighs everything else that's being mentioned. But what are these things? Because on the internet, you can get free, massive online education courses, which is of better quality than the poorly funded schools in Africa and yes, even in America. So you want free education, the internet has that, right? You get access to information beyond traditional media, which is monopolized by the state, or worse still, in communities for whom like religion and tribal leaders are able to have absolute power over individuals by using divide and conquer. So access to the internet allows for things like individuals in authoritarian regimes to realize like the shit that's going on in their country. So we look at what happened in the fall of the Soviet Union, for example, or how we saw the largest democratic revolution in the world, the Arab Spring, which was organized via the internet, where people shared information about like what was government abuse that was happening and was able to hold their governments more accountable. So like OG talked about the birth lottery, right? But they just mentioned it. We explained to you what this looks like. This looks like massive rural-urban migration, overcrowded megacities, having to live in slums with those exact same unsanitary conditions because the only way you can make for a life for yourself is to uproot yourself from the fucking farm and move to the megacity. And mind you, that's the best case scenario for those people. How about those people who are not lucky enough to be able to travel to the city? You become a farmer or you work at a sweatshop, you still get fucking exploited by the capitalistic structures because you're in industries that are raised to the bottom and non-sustainable in the long run. And then what does O say? The O says, but the government can also manipulate the internet. What? But the truth is, unless you are the Republic of China, this is practically impossible for most countries. Like I think most other countries don't have that sort of funds and capacity to be able to control the internet to the excess. Before I move on closing.
Right, so China's rise was predicated upon an incredibly limited access to the internet. On your side, when you say that there is a human right to internet access, do you just mean connectivity or do you perhaps mean free access to the internet?
So two things. Like I think even with the Great Firewall of China, you still get access to a lot of internet services. Secondly, I think China rise came at a time where it's still possible because they have the natural resources as well as human labor to be able to enter manufacturing, things that have long passed and it's no longer possible for third world countries now in Africa to move past the same model. They need to move into the internet age because the world has left them behind. But more importantly, we think once something is enshrined on the right, obviously we can also stop governments like, for example, I don't know, the Syrian government from shutting down the internet to hide their atrocities or to prevent protests from organizing in the first place. And I think that's a massive benefit. Right, so in CG, what do they say? They say, oh, but what about food, water, and education? I think it's really stupid coming from me. One, the provision of food, water, and education, which are commodities, relies upon the competence and benevolence of governmental agencies. Most of these countries which suffer from hunger, lack of water, and all these things, right, are generally tend to be corrupt, authoritarian, or are captured by the elite. We think the internet does not, on the other hand, rely upon these governments because when the UN and all these tech companies come in, they have sufficient political and financial power to be able to bypass the government. Secondly, we think that it's untrue that the trade-off is real. If what Shermaine says is real, which is that when they introduce a new priority, food and water goes away, then by her logic, when the UN decides to have a department for women's rights, right, they would have taken all the food for African children and gave it to empower women. And that's not how things work, right? Because with greater international awareness of like more things that are important, brings greater economic and political capital that come in that wouldn't have gone to food and water anyway. We propose.
Thanks, Speaker, for that speech. Close out the debate, opposition whip.
The closing government case does sound alluring to some extent. It might sound good, it might be true that growth sounds pretty incredible. But if the devotion of giant internet infrastructure to which developing countries have to construct, or the idea that you have to spend lots of economic investment in granting each and every individual a handphone within your own country,
those are both monetary and political investment that Shermy talks about, lends itself to a huge trade-off that often necessitates a worse off life for individuals on the ground. And I think the trade-offs were pretty important that we heard little to no responses coming up from Alfred. The first thing that we suggest is that other rights that are more important for these countries, especially your developing countries, especially when we're talking about rural areas, rights such as clean sanitation, the ability to live a reasonably decent life in those areas are presumably more important than your ability to access internet. Because the way to which you hear the government frames the end point of accessing internet is merely about circumventing the inequality that exists. So I just want to do a balance in terms of comparing what exactly do developing countries need the most. Because if we can just suggest to you that the ability to have access to food, the ability to have access to a free and reasonably decent life such as clean sanitation is perhaps presumably more important than your ability to circumvent the inequality that does exist within those situations. But the second thing I do want to suggest in this debate as well is that even if we want to talk about inequality, I don't think government bench ever once talk about why the instrument of the internet is the only way or the only solution to which we are able to overcome or override the inequality or structures of inequality that currently exist. So I just want to quickly point out the enclosing government, right? If you listen to the first block of extension coming up from Justin's speech, he claims that internet access is necessary for the undignified. The argument about overcoming inequality is just another term for economic emancipation and civic discussion that OG talks about. So a large part of Justin's extension is really non-existent. But if you want to talk about the context of developing countries, and that's why Shermy's point of information is critical within this discussion, right? Is that the human rights that government bench have to defend is not merely increasing connectivity for individuals, but it's about the unfettered access to information and knowledge through the tools of the internet. And there was never once any form of discussion as to why that instrument in itself lends itself to greater degrees of exploitation and abuses vis-a-vis any other kind of infrastructures or any other kind of structural rights that we talk about. So I want to quickly deal with that afterwards, right? As to whether there's a symmetrical equivalence or whether there's an equivalence of importance between the right of education that we grant to individuals that may potentially be exploited by the government versus the right to internet access. And this is things that opening opposition never once wanted to contest, right? No, thank you. So this nicely moves on to the discussion about opening half then. Because OG's claim is the freedom to associate with whoever and whatever you want, in spite of geographical boundaries, is an a priori right in and of itself. One is that there's little to no discussion, right? Because if it's true, and the context that Yalkun talks about is that the world is increasingly interconnected, I would also posit that the flow of labor happens across borders a lot more likely in both scenarios as well. That is to say, more and more individuals are increasingly empowered to leave the communities that they perhaps do not or are able to associate themselves with. So it's unclear to me why internet access is the only way to achieve this. But I want to give the other suggestion here, which is you are aware of a community out there that is perhaps a lot more attuned to what you want. The question therefore becomes about whether you have the agency and the power to therefore move across borders or even have connection with these individuals. Because I would suggest the reason for why such dissatisfaction exists in the first place and why it increases exponentially for individuals is because you have access to this information. Because the determination of happiness is often seen relative to other versions of happiness that you can potentially see. So before the rise of the internet, maybe Alfred once thought himself as the best debater in the entire world. But upon the rise of the internet, where he sees many great debaters like Chris Bissett, maybe he feels shit about himself. And I think that's what's important in the debate, right? Because independent of whether you get access to this information or knowledge, maybe self-containment or maybe the idea of ignorance is not an a priori bet that individuals necessarily have to be forced upon. I would suggest you can be incredibly happy and incredibly feeling empowered even in situations where you are ignorant of what the relative standards of happiness are coming up from the side of GovBench as a whole. But the second thing I therefore want to talk about in this debate as well is the distribution and consumption of information. And I think the problem with opening government is that all the benefits they talk about is premised on two assumptions. One is that the information on the internet is on balance something that's accurate to a reasonable extent and that there's some form of meaningful civic discussion or political discussion that individuals can engage in. But if you actually listen to both speeches coming up from Yalkun and Yan, there's actually no mechanisms to prove why the kind of discussions that you are going to get is one that's a lot more meaningful. But I would suggest that the flip side, on balance, is perhaps a lot worse. when you are able to see foreign influence and foreign intervention in the kind of political and civic discussion that happens within your own national boundaries. So when Russia decides to hack the servers of the United States or decides to propagate like false information and false data within the United States, actively harm the civic situation and political situation within the United States. And I think the discussion got very disingenuous in the Gov bench because there was never a discussion to the implication and the impact of harm that stems from the internet access being exploited versus the kind of harm that exists from all the other alternatives that we talked about. So the simple response coming from our bench in response to our argumentation coming from opening opposition is that perhaps we have your own home news location, is that I want to talk about the extent of harm that stems from both these accounts, right? And I don't think it's important to discuss the benefits under both sides because in the best possible scenario, I can acknowledge and I can concede that economic emancipation might potentially happen. But I think it's a question between the right to education versus the right to internet and all other rights that the government currently enshrine as to whether the right in itself lends itself to a greater degree of exploitation and abuse. The first thing I want to suggest is that when it comes to the right of internet access, and that's a Shermi's point that's important, right? When she says that it's unfettered access to information, it means that you grant the government no tools to ever limit the kind of discussion that's happening on the internet, because to do anything that transgresses the rights that individuals have means that the government in and of itself is at fault. But the second thing is, it's incredibly easy for the government to hide digital tracing and digital footprints of their own involvement in the internet versus when it comes to actual educational policies, they can physically trace it back to the government or to the individual that constructs those policies. So it's a question, if both sides wanted to talk about whether we can regulate these rights effectively to reduce the amount of harm that happens across individual, the right to the internet access is an instrument or is a system that you can never potentially regulate under the world of Gov bench, and therefore the harm is exponentially created that all individuals in society suffers from. Closing opposition.
There we are. Thank you all for that debate. Cross shake hands.
Go shake hands.